There has been some drama recently in the eNASCAR Pro community, especially after a particularly messy race at Pocono. On social media, many of the drivers are complaining about the driving standards in the series, and many old heads are saying it was much better in their time. So, are they correct? Well, I wanted to answer this through hard evidence, so with some help, I went through every single Pro Series race since 2013 and counted the number of cautions in each race to see if the races have actually gotten more dirty over the years. And spoiler alert, the results are pretty surprising. In fact, the chart of our initial findings actually trends in the opposite direction, seemingly saying that there have been less cautions over time. But I promise you, it gets much more complicated than that. So let's take a deep dive. First off, I want to admit that this first chart lies a little bit to you guys because of race lengths. In the past 2 years, iRacing has done away with the 50% race length that they have done for most of its history and have now gone to a bit shorter of races, including some heat and feature races that add up to even less amounts of laps. So to compensate for this, let's multiply the number of cautions on average in the last 2 seasons by 1.25. And when we do that, we see that the trend line is actually trending slightly upwards now, but it's nothing too convincing one way or the other. In fact, you would probably be right to say that there isn't even a trend here. We would have to look even deeper to understand what's going on with this graph. I think there are 3 main factors that ultimately determine how clean or dirty a race ends up. Number 1 is the car. Number 2 is the drivers, and number 3 is the rules or the governing body. All 3 of these things have seen pretty drastic changes over time, and you can see that show up in this graph. Honestly, I think the absolute biggest factor that goes into how clean or dirty a race is the car. So let's see what the trends are like here. Starting with the data in 2013, all the way up until 2019, there was a high horsepower Gen 6 car as the car for the Coca-Cola series and the Peak series. Throughout these 6 years, the car was fairly consistent. The tire model was on the old V6 and earlier tire model that wasn't physically modeled like the new V7 Plus tire model is. And also, even if the bodywork got updated over time, the cars were still the high horsepower Gen 6 cars that would handle more or less the same throughout all 6 years. If you weren't around back then, these cars were extremely difficult to handle, especially on the ice racing type tire model. And going back and watching where cautions came from in some of these races, you can see that a lot of them come from the drivers just overstepping their bounds and making mistakes. Another thing to note about these cars is the damage model and the drafting model. For the damage model, a little bit of damage could affect your car, and a lot of damage would just take you out of a competitive spot, meaning that the races got spread out pretty quickly. Along with that, the drafting model was not as strong back then, meaning that cars could not form a train together as easily. So these races have a lot of cautions, but they don't come from big crashes with a ton of cars. And if they did, they would knock out a good portion of those cars, leading to less cautions throughout the race from then on out. Instead, many of the cautions started with 1 car spinning or 2 cars getting in an incident, or maybe cautions breeding cautions on a restart. You could argue that these type of cautions are what happened in real life for the most part too. So while the pure number of cautions is just as high back then as it was today, I can see why there wouldn't be as many contentious incidents, and some people may think more fondly back on that. But at the same time, I still think there is some rose-tinted glasses revisionist history going on. For example, in 2017, there were 4 races that had double-digit cautions, a feat that no other season in iRacing Pro history has ever had. But you could argue with the normalized results that the 2023 season is just as bad, but we'll get into that later. The next era of Pro eNASCAR Cup car is the Gen 6 low horsepower car, which is probably the least popular car out of all of these, but ironically comes out on top when producing the cleanest racing. Going from 2019 to 2021, this season provided 3 of the cleanest seasons that iRacing has ever seen in their Pro Series. 2021 is the shining example of all seasons, with an average of only 3.17 cautions per race when not taking into account road courses. But 2020 is not that far behind, considering they have 2 really bad races. In fact, if you're curious, the worst race in terms of number of cautions in iRacing Pro Series history is in 2020, during one of its cleanest eras at Richmond. In this race, there was 16 cautions in 200 scheduled laps, which ended up being 207, for a total of 77 caution laps. That's right, over 1/3 of this Pro Series race was run under caution, so the pace car led the most laps out of the entire field. Outside of these outliers, the 2019 to 2021 era of iRacing Pro Series was definitely the cleanest. There were 13 races at least during this era where there was only 1 or 0 cautions for the entire race. To put that into perspective, in the past 2 seasons of the Coke Series, that has happened exactly once. Some of the factors that encouraged cleaner racing with this car was the horrible dirty air situation where it was very hard to pass, and while the drivers were locked together with a draft, it would be very hard to even get side by side with someone. On top of that, the low horsepower nature of the cars just made them a lot easier to control, not much effort in keeping the car going straight, and people would be a lot more in control of what they were doing, leading to less just overall lack of talent cautions. And honestly, with those points, even though they're creating less cautions, it kind of just sounds less fun. But my question is this the real golden era that some of these pro level drivers are referring to? Because while it was definitely the cleanest, I can almost guarantee you that none of them look back on this era that fondly. But that leads us into the current era, the Gen 7 or next gen era. The moment this series hit the next gen, the caution spiked up with it, almost doubling from 2021 to 2022, and then peaking again in 2023. The worst race to come out of this was the penultimate race in the 2023 season, where there were 14 cautions in just 120 laps at Phoenix. After moving on to the next gen, the number of cautions have been pretty much equal to what they were during the early Gen 6 era at only a fraction of the laps. But what about this car allows this situation to happen? Well, first and foremost is probably the damage model. These cars are indestructible. Take a look at the race from last week at Pocono, and the third place car on a late race restart doesn't have a bumper on it. Yes, he might be there because of pit strategy and shuffling, but he is able to hold up the field for a decent amount of time considering it's a big track like Pocono. When I compare the iRacing Next Gen cars to the cars in real life, sure, the cosmetic damage might look similarly, but when a car in the Next Gen in real life takes a hard hit and the car usually looks okay, they usually mess up something on the inside of the car that just takes them out of the race entirely. Having these cars be indestructible tanks really incentivizes the drivers out there to make any sort of move that they want, even if they think they're going to get some damage from it. So you see a lot more stupid moves, dumb aggressive decisions, just because they know that their consequences aren't that bad with this car. On top of that, the current drafting model of the car keeps all of the cars together, kind of like in real life, but because in iRacing everyone's setups are close enough, I'm not saying that they're equal, but they're close enough to mean that they can just be in one pack for the entire race and not have any separation like you would see in real life. And even though these cars are fairly easy to drive, especially comparing them to the old Gen 6 high horsepower car, this is made up for the fact that the cars in a more compact scenario will cause a lot more incidents from driver to driver and not just driver versus car. But how much of this is due to car and how much of this is due to the driver attitude in the series? We have pretty much seen an entire changing of the guard in the competitive esports iRacing oval community over the past decade. There are only 3 drivers that have competed in both the 2013 season and the 2024 season. So with all the new faces, have we seen new levels of driver aggression? I think the best way to track this is through driver suspensions. One of the aspects that a lot of people don't know about the iRacing Coca-Cola series is their penalty system. The system is a little complicated, but basically you accrue incident points by being the cause of wrecks, and they go away over time a little slower by having clean races. And if you accrue enough incident points, you get banned for a race. Now, who exactly gets suspended isn't always public. Someone could just be missing a race for personal reasons, but from the data that I am seeing, the number of suspensions has actually gone down throughout recent times, with the exception of 2023. And if you're following along, yeah, 2023 was just kind of a bad year. But even with all of the drama from this year and people saying how it's always the usual suspects, there has not been one single suspension yet in the 2024 season, though there still is some races to go, and supposedly a lot of people are getting close to that number. There have always been people that treat the Pro Series a little bit more aggressively than others, and I don't think that that part of it has particularly changed. That's not to say that I think the drivers can't be doing any better though. I mean, if you have a 14 caution race, I think that no matter what the car is, what the track is, there are a lot of people in that race who could be doing better. And finally, the last factor, the format and the rules of the series. We already touched on this a little bit about the penalty point system, but I think that that's an interesting implication to bring up again. Because definitely drivers will drive different if there are no consequences to their actions. I guarantee you, if you get rid of that penalty point system, there are going to be a lot more cautions in these races. So maybe even cracking down on the penalty system more, meaning less incidents leads to a race ban, that might actually make the racing even cleaner. In terms of the format for the Drivers' World Championship for Oval, prior to 2017, it was a straight points format, but from 2018 onward is when you added the playoffs and different formats of the playoffs and different cutoff races and more drama-filled races. And you can look at some of the outliers on this list for a huge number of caution races, and a lot of them line up to win and you're in scenarios for certain drivers. And maybe that's what they want. They want the more drama, they want the cars bunched closer together, but when it gets to a point where almost half the race is under caution, it's probably more of a buzzkill than anything. Interestingly enough, the final championship race of the season tends to be fairly clean, not having any huge number of cautions. I think that the aggression levels have less to do with the people battling for wins and championships than the overall battle for people towards the mid-pack. Because when you have cars that like to draft with each other and stay close to each other, a lot of that accordion ends up boiling over in the middle of the field. And the Coke Series as a league has an incentive to race for 20th to 30th place that not a lot of other leagues have, and that is the implication of the relegation to the Pro League. The top 20 drivers in Coke Series will make it to next year without having to do anything else, while the bottom 20 will have to go fight for their lives again in a multi-week saga in the Pro Series. Now, I know a lot of drivers would love to avoid having to go through that again, so that leads to a lot of really feisty midfield battles that end up leading to a lot of cautions. But at the end of the day, I don't think that the format actually has that much to do with the number of cautions, because people at that level are gonna fight for their lives anyways. They don't need more incentive to do it. So is the drama on Twitter backed up by data? Yes, but not as strongly as you might believe. Cautions and restarts and wrecks have always been a mainstay in NASCAR esports. It's just hard to not have it that way. The drivers at the top of their game are so close in skill level that they're always going to be driving next to each other, and something always has the potential of going wrong. While I think having a car that encourages hard racing is ultimately the biggest factor that goes into all of this, everyone plays their own part. And while I personally haven't driven at a level to lecture anybody on how to drive a Pro Series race, sometimes when you watch those races and see those moves, you just think, did that really need to happen? But that's not for me to decide, because at the end of the day, I'm just a guy who likes spreadsheets a little too much. Thank you all for watching. Hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you all on the track.